The unseen billionaire, Harry Rodriguez, carefully set the final empty soup pot on the stainless steel counter of the bustling community shelter. The mingling aromas of leftover stew, dish soap, and freshly baked bread filled the air. A soft autumn breeze drifted through the shelter's open window, mixing with the chatter of people finishing their meals. Harry ran a tired hand across his brow, feeling the satisfying ache in his arms after hours of washing dishes, ladling soup, and chatting with the shelter's guests. "Thanks again for all your help, Harry," said Martha, the shelter's coordinator, her gray hair tied back in a messy bun as she stacked empty trays. "We wouldn't know what to do without you around here." "You're a blessing." Harry gave her a warm smile. "It's my pleasure, Martha. You know how much this place means to me." After a few final goodbyes, Harry shrugged on his worn denim jacket and glanced at his watch. He had just enough time to make his evening flight. As he walked out into the chilly parking lot, he headed toward a modest, slightly dented Toyota Camry, his steady companion for nearly a decade. With billions in the bank, Harry could have driven a luxury car or flown in a private jet, but he'd long decided that wealth wasn't a reason to distance himself from real life. Growing up in a struggling, single-parent household had kept him grounded even after he'd made his fortune in technology. His success had given him the freedom to choose a quiet life and share his wealth where it was needed most. As he drove to the airport, Harry's mind wandered to his childhood, filled with evenings spent doing homework by candlelight during power outages and scavenging change with his mother just to get by. These memories didn't haunt him. They fueled him, reminding him why he spent his spare time at the shelter and why he continued to live simply despite his wealth. After parking, Harry slung his well-worn backpack over his shoulder and made his way into the terminal, blending in effortlessly with the crowd in his faded jeans and comfortable sneakers. He liked it that way, enjoying the freedom of moving unnoticed. The hum of travelers surrounded him, the sound of distant announcements merging with the soft echo of rolling suitcases on tile. When Harry reached the security checkpoint, he joined the line and waited his turn. The TSA agent, a tall, unsmiling woman, barely glanced at him as she checked his ID. Without a word, she waved him through, though her friendly smile had been reserved for the businessman just ahead of him. Harry shrugged it off, used to the dismissive glances from people who assumed his quiet presence didn't demand respect. To him, it was almost refreshing. At the X-ray machine, he removed his shoes and set his backpack on the conveyor belt. As he placed his laptop into a gray plastic bin, a security officer gestured toward him with a stern look. "Take it out," he barked. Harry, who was already in the process of removing the laptop, gave a small nod. "Already done." The officer's expression softened for only a moment before he turned his attention to the next traveler. Once through security, Harry took a moment to gather his belongings, retying his sneakers and straightening his shirt. Glancing down the terminal hall, he saw a line forming at a coffee cart and figured he had time for a cup. He patiently waited his turn, but as he stepped up to the counter, the barista looked past him and served the next customer, a man in a tailored suit. Excuse me," Harry said politely, stepping forward once more. The barista finally turned, her smile nowhere to be found. "What can I get for you?" "Just a regular black coffee, please." She poured it wordlessly, handing it over without a hint of warmth. Harry didn't take offense. He'd long since grown accustomed to being overlooked. As he walked toward the gate, he noticed the respectful nods given to travelers in suits or those pulling high-end luggage. No one even glanced at him. He approached the check-in counter to confirm his seat, and the airline attendant behind the desk continued typing on her computer, giving no indication she had noticed him. "Excuse me," Harry said politely. The attendant finally glanced up, offering a tight-lipped, almost annoyed smile. "Destination: Chicago, please." She checked his ticket without a word, sliding his boarding pass across the counter before looking past him to the next passenger. He picked it up, still calm, though he noticed how her demeanor changed as she greeted the next passenger with a warm, "Have a nice flight, sir." Harry found his gate, made his way down the jet bridge, and stepped onto the plane, exhaling as the cool, pine-scented air greeted him. The first-class cabin gleamed with its polished surfaces and plush leather seats. A tall, stern-looking flight attendant stood at the entrance, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her name tag reading Linda. Her eyes fell on Harry, and she gave a faint, almost imperceptible frown. "Excuse me, sir," she called out in a firm, crisp tone that caused several heads to turn. "This is the first-class cabin." Harry smiled gently, understanding the assumption she was making. "Yes, I'm aware." Linda's frown deepened as she stepped directly in his path, blocking him. "I'll need to see your boarding pass," she said, her tone carrying the distinct edge of suspicion. Harry produced his boarding pass without a word. Linda snatched it, studying it intently as if searching for something suspicious. She glanced up at Harry, her gaze a mix of confusion and doubt. "These seats cost thousands of dollars, you know," she said, emphasizing the word thousands, as though it were inconceivable he could afford it. Harry's calm smile never wavered. "I'm well aware of the price." Linda's skepticism didn't fade. She gave a short, dismissive laugh, folding her arms across her chest. "Sir, I've worked this route for years, and I don't recall seeing you in first class before." "Perhaps this is your lucky day, then," Harry replied, his tone light, though his hands tightened slightly around his backpack strap. Linda's expression grew sterner. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number, speaking in a hushed tone before hanging up. Within minutes, 2 uniformed airport security officers appeared. Linda gestured to Harry. "This passenger's ticket doesn't add up," she said with a tight-lipped smile. "I don't feel comfortable with him remaining on board." The officers exchanged glances, eyeing Harry's ticket. "It appears valid," one of them said quietly, but Linda remained firm. "I don't care what it appears to be," she said, her voice sharp. "I am the senior flight attendant, and I have the right to remove any passenger I deem suspicious. I want him off this flight." Harry noticed the looks of discomfort on the faces of nearby passengers. With a quiet dignity, he retrieved his backpack from the overhead compartment and followed the officers off the plane. As he stepped back into the terminal, he felt the weight of the stares from the passengers, their pity and discomfort evident. The officers led him to a nearby bench and muttered an apology before returning to the plane, looking visibly uncomfortable. Harry sat in silence, his eyes focused on the floor as he processed the unfairness of the situation. After a moment, he took a deep breath and reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen before he dialed a number he rarely used. "James," he said softly, once the line connected. "I need you to gather the legal team." James, his trusted assistant, immediately picked up on the seriousness of Harry's tone. "Are you all right, Harry?" Harry's gaze shifted toward the plane, which was beginning to taxi away from the gate. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice held a calm resolve. "But something just happened that I think we both know can't go ignored." As he ended the call, Harry watched the plane take off without him, leaving a quiet resolve simmering within him. He'd faced prejudice before, but this time, he felt compelled to take action, not out of revenge, but to prevent this from happening to others who couldn't fight back as easily as he could. This wasn't about wealth, reputation, or pride. It was about standing up for dignity and respect, something everyone deserved, regardless of their appearance. The breaking point. As Harry sat in the bustling terminal, he felt the weight of his emotions settle around him, a potent mix of hurt, indignation, and, most of all, a resolve for change. Despite his calm demeanor, his mind raced through the countless times he'd faced prejudice cloaked in professionalism. People often thought wealth would shield him, but Harry knew all too well that wealth didn't change how people judged based on appearance alone. After a few quiet moments, Harry's assistant, James, arrived, his face flushed with concern. Dressed sharply in a suit, James looked every bit the stereotypical image of a businessman, and Harry noticed the difference in how people reacted to his presence. "Harry, are you all right?" James asked, worry written across his face as he took the seat beside him. "I'm fine," Harry replied, his voice calm but his eyes steely. "But this isn't about me. It's about everyone who doesn't have the means to respond. I can't just let this slide, James." James nodded, understanding the gravity in Harry's words. Harry's philanthropic work wasn't just for show. It was his way of staying connected to the life he had left behind, but never forgotten. His success had come from determination, intelligence, and countless late nights, but it had never clouded his sense of empathy or dulled the sting of discrimination. James took out his phone, ready to take notes as Harry outlined his next steps. "I want a meeting with the airline's executive team," Harry said. "But before we get into that, I want you to prepare a letter to the board of directors. I'm going to push for change, and they need to know exactly what I have in mind." "Understood," James replied. "Do you want to pursue any direct legal action?" Harry shook his head. "Not yet. Let's see how they respond. This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability and improvement. But I want to see actual changes implemented, not just lip service." As they left the airport, Harry's mind lingered on the face of the flight attendant, Linda, and the way she had looked at him. Not with curiosity, but with disdain, a quick judgment cast without a second thought. He knew that look. It was the same one he'd seen too many times, the one that stripped away his humanity in favor of a stereotype. But he wasn't just angry. He was sad, knowing that such prejudice was woven into society so deeply that it could rob people of basic respect. Meanwhile, on the plane, Linda's sense of satisfaction was interrupted when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calling her to the cockpit immediately. Passengers glanced at her curiously as she made her way forward, a faint crease of annoyance appearing on her otherwise composed face. She straightened her uniform and stepped into the cockpit, closing the door behind her. Captain Stevens, a veteran pilot with over 20 years of service, looked unusually serious. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the controls, his face set in a frown. "What's going on, Captain?" Linda asked, a trace of impatience in her voice. Stevens looked up, his expression hard. "Linda, we just received an urgent call from corporate. That passenger you just removed." He paused, letting the silence weigh heavily in the enclosed space. "His name is Harry Rodriguez. He owns a significant share of this airline and sits on our board of directors." Linda's face went pale, her composed mask crumbling. "But he didn't look. I mean, he was just..." Her voice trailed off as the reality sank in. Stevens continued, his tone unforgiving. "He was removed without cause, based solely on your assumption. Corporate wants you to report directly to the main office as soon as we land. They're not happy, Linda." Linda's stomach dropped, her hands beginning to tremble. She thought back to the way she had scrutinized Harry's boarding pass, the way she had questioned his right to be in first class. She had assumed he didn't belong simply because he didn't fit her mental image of a first-class passenger. Now that hasty judgment could cost her everything she had worked for. As she left the cockpit, her mind replayed the incident in agonizing detail. She remembered Harry's calm demeanor, the quiet way he had accepted her treatment, the humiliation he must have felt, the quiet dignity in his eyes. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she began to understand the full gravity of what she had done. The rest of the flight passed in a haze for Linda. Her mind was elsewhere as she went through the motions, her interactions with passengers hollow and forced. When they finally landed, she gathered her things quickly, trying to avoid the looks from the other crew members who seemed to have already heard whispers of what had happened. At the airport, she was met by a stern-looking HR representative who escorted her to a small conference room in the airline's office. The fluorescent lights hummed above as Linda took a seat, her hands clammy as she clasped them on her lap. A few moments later, Mr. Collins, the airline's regional manager, entered, his expression somber. "Linda," he began, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to discuss the incident with Mr. Rodriguez." Linda attempted to hold her composure, offering a rehearsed defense. "I was simply following protocol, Mr. Collins. I thought he looked suspicious." "Suspicious?" Mr. Collins echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Linda, you removed a passenger who had a valid first-class ticket, based on your assumption. And now we're dealing with a PR nightmare that could jeopardize our reputation." I didn't know he was someone important," Linda stammered, her voice wavering. Mr. Collins gave her a long, hard look. "Important or not, every passenger deserves basic respect. Mr. Rodriguez has chosen not to pursue legal action, for now, but he's requesting a meeting with our board to discuss comprehensive policy changes." Linda's mind spun as she absorbed the implications. "But what does that mean for me?" Mr. Collins folded his hands. "There will be an internal investigation, Linda, and based on the outcome, disciplinary action will be taken. This incident has exposed flaws in our handling of discriminatory complaints, and we're looking into every complaint associated with you in the past." The words hung in the air, and Linda felt as though the ground was slipping away beneath her. Complaints. Had there really been so many? She thought back over the years, all the little interactions she had dismissed as routine, all the times she had acted out of standard protocol without considering the people behind the tickets. She had convinced herself it was professionalism, but now she saw it for what it was, a shield for her prejudice. "Please wait here while we continue our investigation," Mr. Collins said, standing up to leave. "You'll be informed of our decision shortly." Linda sat alone in the empty conference room, her mind reeling. She thought about her husband, Paul, her daughter, Emily, and the life they had built together. Her job had been a point of pride, something she had believed was untouchable. But now, as she sat there, she saw how easily it could all crumble. In his own office, Harry's assistant, James, was finalizing the proposal they would present to the airline. Harry's requirements were clear and unwavering. The airline would need to implement comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training, overseen by a diversity and inclusion board comprised of individuals from different backgrounds and communities. This wasn't just about one person's bias. It was about creating a system that valued dignity and respect for every passenger, regardless of appearance. As James reviewed the proposal, he looked up at Harry, who was leaning back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Are you sure you don't want any personal retribution? This could be a huge settlement." Harry shook his head slowly. "Money won't fix this, James. But maybe if we push hard enough, we can make sure the next person treated like I was has a different experience." Later that night, as Linda returned home, she was greeted by her husband and daughter, their voices cheerful, unaware of the storm brewing around her. She forced a smile, trying to maintain her usual demeanor, but she could feel the cracks in her armor. For the first time, she realized she had let her assumptions take over, treating people based on appearance rather than humanity. And now, the weight of those assumptions bore down on her, threatening to unravel the life she had worked so hard to build. Her once unshakable confidence wavered, replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. She knew, deep down, that the days ahead would demand a reckoning, both from her employers and, most painfully, from herself. Facing consequences. The following morning, Linda awoke to a strange quietness, the kind that often precedes a storm. Her head pounded with memories of the previous day, of the meeting with Mr. Collins, and the emptiness that had followed. The usually pleasant morning sunlight through her kitchen window felt harsh today, as if casting a spotlight on the turmoil brewing inside her. She couldn't bring herself to tell her husband, Paul, about the suspension or the internal investigation. Instead, she lingered at the breakfast table, her coffee growing cold as she sat lost in thought. At work, the airline's HR team was deep in discussion over Linda's behavior. They had spent the better part of the night combing through years of passenger complaints, each one telling a similar story. An overzealous flight attendant who frequently questioned the legitimacy of certain passengers based solely on appearance. As they reviewed her record, the emerging pattern left little room for doubt. Mr. Collins, normally patient, felt his frustration mounting as he realized how long this issue had gone unaddressed. 17 complaints in the last 2 years alone, noted Sarah from HR, pushing a thick stack of documents across the table, each one a variation on the same theme: targeted scrutiny, dismissal, and often hostility. Mr. Collins looked over the papers, his brows furrowing. How on earth did these go overlooked for so long? James, another HR representative, glanced over the spreadsheet on his laptop. Most of these complaints were addressed with a verbal or written warning. It's possible they were viewed as isolated incidents. Mr. Peterson from the legal team spoke up, a frown creasing his face. This pattern is undeniable. And in light of what happened with Mr. Rodriguez, this isn't something we can sweep under the rug. If the media gets hold of this, we're looking at a full-scale PR crisis. Mr. Collins sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as he leaned back in his chair. So we're potentially facing not just one lawsuit, but the prospect of multiple past complaints being reopened. We can't afford this exposure. As they deliberated on Linda's fate, Harry was meeting with his own legal team to finalize the proposal he would present to the airline's board. Sitting in the spacious conference room of his office, he looked out the window, lost in thought as the lawyers around him discussed logistics and legal terms. His assistant, James, brought him back to the moment. "Harry," James said, tapping a document on the table, "your request for diversity training, external audits, and an inclusion board. You know that's going to require a long-term commitment from the airline, right? This isn't a quick fix." Harry nodded, his expression calm but determined. "That's exactly the point, James. A band-aid solution won't help. I want this to be a structural change. If they want my continued support, they need to commit." Margaret, his lead counsel, raised an eyebrow. "You're really willing to risk your shares to make this happen?" Harry met her gaze, unflinching. "What good is my investment if it enables this kind of treatment? If we don't push for real change, this will just happen to someone else." The legal team exchanged looks, impressed by Harry's dedication. They had seen many powerful clients before, but few with his sense of purpose. He wasn't interested in revenge or compensation. He genuinely wanted the airline to become a better, more inclusive organization. Later that day, Harry and his team sat down with the airline's board of directors in a high-rise conference room overlooking the city. The board members, aware of Harry's influential stake in the company, were visibly nervous as they greeted him. They had seen the preliminary outline of his proposal and understood the magnitude of what he was asking. Once everyone was seated, Harry began, his voice steady and firm. "I'm not here to litigate one incident or assign blame to any one individual. This isn't about a single flight or one person's actions. This is about the culture within this organization and how it needs to change." He laid out his expectations: mandatory sensitivity and diversity training for all employees, quarterly audits by an external agency, and the creation of an inclusion board to oversee these efforts. Each element was designed not only to prevent incidents like his own, but to create a culture where all passengers felt respected and valued. As he finished, there was a moment of silence. The board members looked at each other, absorbing the implications of his demands. Finally, the chairman, a gray-haired man with a thoughtful expression, spoke up. "Mr. Rodriguez, your commitment to this cause is commendable, but you must understand, implementing these changes will take time, resources, and full cooperation across all departments." Harry leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Then make it happen. This isn't a negotiation. If you want my continued support, you'll prioritize these changes, starting now." The chairman nodded slowly, sensing the resolve in Harry's tone. "Very well. We'll do everything in our power to meet your expectations." Meanwhile, Linda's anxiety was reaching a breaking point. She had barely slept, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. She replayed her actions over and over in her mind, each memory tinged with guilt. She thought about the times she had dismissed passengers who didn't look the part, her insistence on enforcing standards as she saw fit. Each interaction now felt like a piece of evidence in a case against her, and she couldn't deny the truth any longer. That evening, Linda's husband, Paul, noticed the tension she couldn't hide. He placed a hand on her shoulder as she sat staring blankly at her untouched dinner. "Linda," he said gently, "you haven't been yourself these past few days. Are you sure everything is okay?" Linda's throat tightened. She had always prided herself on being composed, the one who held everything together. But now, facing the possibility of losing her career, she felt as if her entire world was unraveling. "It's work," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I made a mistake, Paul. A big one." Paul's brow furrowed with concern as he took her hand. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it together. You're only human, Linda. We all make mistakes." Linda swallowed hard, wishing she could believe his words. But deep down, she knew this was more than a simple mistake. It was the culmination of years of unchecked bias, of a mindset that had allowed her to judge people based on appearance without a second thought. As Paul held her hand, she found herself finally voicing her fears. "What if I lose my job? What if I've been wrong all this time?" Paul gave her a sympathetic smile. "Then maybe it's time to look at things differently. Change isn't easy, but it's never too late to grow." In the days that followed, Linda received a call from the HR department. She was asked to come in for a final meeting to discuss the results of the investigation. The weight of dread sat heavy in her chest as she walked through the airline's headquarters, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She passed by familiar faces who either looked away or gave her sympathetic nods. News of the incident had spread quickly, and it felt as though everyone had already written her off. Inside the meeting room, Mr. Collins and the HR team awaited her arrival. The atmosphere was tense as she took her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Linda," Mr. Collins began, his tone measured but firm, "our investigation has revealed a consistent pattern of discriminatory behavior that cannot be overlooked. Given the impact this has had on passengers and the potential liability to our organization, we're left with no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately." Linda's heart sank, her face going pale as she absorbed the finality of his words. Terminated. It was the end of her career, her livelihood. She had spent over 2 decades with the airline, pouring herself into her work, but it had all been undone by her own actions. As she handed over her ID badge and security card, a surge of regret filled her. She had clung to her assumptions, to her narrow view of who belonged and who didn't, until it cost her everything. Now she was left with the harsh reality of her choices and a newfound awareness of the harm her biases had caused. As she left the office, Linda felt a strange mix of despair and clarity. She had been so certain, so assured in her judgments, but now she saw herself for what she was, someone who had allowed prejudice to guide her actions. And as painful as it was, she knew this was the beginning of a hard but necessary journey of self-reflection. Harry, meanwhile, received confirmation from the airline's board that his proposal for systemic change would move forward. His demands had been met, and he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that he had used his experience to push for something meaningful. In the back of his mind, though, he thought of Linda. He knew that real change would come only if people like her could confront their biases and grow beyond them. And as he looked out his office window, he hoped that somewhere Linda was beginning to understand the true value of empathy and respect. Seeds of change. Days after her termination, Linda found herself adrift, her once regimented life reduced to an endless stretch of empty time. She spent most days in a daze, unable to shake the shame of her actions. She avoided telling her daughter, Emily, the full truth, but as her severance pay dwindled, the reality loomed closer. Her once secure identity as a respected professional had been shattered, and with it, her sense of self. One afternoon, as she sat by her living room window, gazing blankly at the street, Linda's phone buzzed. She didn't recognize the number, but she picked up, her voice carrying a weariness she hadn't shaken in days. "Hello," Linda speaking. "Hello, Ms. Avery. My name is Lisa Martin, And I'm with the new Diversity and Inclusion Department at your former airline. Mr. Rodriguez has recommended your participation in a series of sensitivity and inclusivity workshops. He feels it could be beneficial for you, and if you're open to it, might even provide you with new professional opportunities down the line. Linda blinked in surprise, her grip tightening on the phone. Harry Rodriguez recommended this. Yes, Ms. Avery. Mr. Rodriguez has been instrumental in setting up these workshops and feels strongly that participants with prior experience in our industry, like yourself, could add unique insights. The idea felt unsettling. Part of her recoiled at the thought of stepping back into an environment where she'd be seen as an example of what went wrong. But deep down, Linda knew she needed this. She needed to understand the magnitude of her actions and, somehow, find a way to make amends. When do they start? Linda asked, her voice wavering. We begin next week, Lisa replied. You'll receive a schedule and materials to review before the first session. We hope this experience will be transformational for everyone involved. Linda thanked her and hung up, staring down at her hands. The decision didn't come easily, but she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in days. A chance to move forward. The first session took place in a modest conference room, filled with participants from different departments across the airline. Linda walked in quietly, avoiding eye contact, feeling the weight of her past actions pressing down on her. She found a seat in the back corner, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. Around her, conversations buzzed softly, and she couldn't help but notice the diverse group assembled. Young and old, people from different racial and cultural backgrounds, some she might have dismissed in the past as not fitting the mold. The facilitator, a woman named Carmen, stood at the front, her expression warm and welcoming. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here. This isn't an easy subject to tackle, but with open minds and empathy, I believe we can make real progress together. Carmen's tone set a comforting atmosphere, and Linda felt herself relax slightly. As the session progressed, Carmen guided them through discussions on implicit bias, personal experiences of discrimination, and the damaging effects of unchecked prejudice. Linda listened intently as her fellow participants shared stories of being misjudged, dismissed, or outright discriminated against. One young man, Rashid, spoke of an incident that hit Linda harder than she expected. He shared how he had been flying home after finishing law school, dressed casually, when a flight attendant had repeatedly questioned his presence in first class, even asking him if he was in the wrong seat. Rashid's voice wavered slightly as he recounted the humiliation of being treated as though he didn't belong, and how it tainted what should have been a moment of pride. Linda felt her stomach twist as she listened. She realized that Rashid's experience mirrored the one she had subjected Harry Rodriguez to, and likely many others. Her gaze dropped to her hands, shame prickling her skin as she faced the human cost of her assumptions. At the end of the session, Carmen invited participants to share any reflections or questions. Linda's pulse quickened as she debated whether to speak up. She knew this was her chance to confront herself and to, in some way, try to make things right. I have something to say. Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper. Heads turned in her direction, and she could feel the weight of their curiosity. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to continue. I was a flight attendant for over 20 years, she said, her voice wavering. And I know that I misjudged people. I made assumptions, treated people poorly, and I don't know how to apologize enough for that. I never thought of myself as a prejudiced person, but now I see how much harm my actions caused. Listening to all of you, I'm realizing just how wrong I was. The room fell into a heavy silence. Linda's eyes remained on her hands, unable to face the faces around her. But then she felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked up to see Rashid, his expression soft with understanding. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, he said quietly. Growth is painful, but if you're willing to learn, then you're on the right path. Linda blinked back tears, her throat tight with gratitude. Rashid's words were the first warmth she'd felt since the incident, and in that moment, she resolved to see this journey through, no matter how uncomfortable it became. Over the next few weeks, Linda attended each session with increasing openness. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the stories and experiences that challenged her long-held beliefs. Gradually, the other participants began to see her transformation, sensing her genuine desire to change. She had become more than just a former flight attendant. She was a person confronting her own flaws and, for the first time, opening herself up to a new understanding of empathy. Meanwhile, Harry continued to monitor the progress of the airline's inclusion and diversity initiatives. Reports from his assistant, James, painted a hopeful picture. The workshops were having a noticeable impact, and employees across the company were beginning to approach their roles with renewed sensitivity and awareness. The diversity board he had proposed was up and running, including members from various backgrounds who were committed to fostering an inclusive culture within the airline. One afternoon, Harry received an email from Carmen, the facilitator leading Linda's workshop. She wanted him to know that Linda had shown remarkable progress and had even reached out to share her story with other staff members. Carmen included a transcript of a speech Linda had given at the most recent workshop, detailing her journey and the ways in which she was learning to move beyond her past mistakes. Reading Linda's words, Harry felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't expected such a profound transformation, but he realized that his efforts had not only helped others, but had planted a seed of change within Linda as well. Then came a surprise invitation. Linda had reached out to Harry, requesting to meet him in person to apologize directly. Carmen conveyed Linda's message with sincerity, explaining that Linda felt a face-to-face conversation would help her express the remorse she couldn't quite capture in writing. Harry hesitated, not because he didn't believe in Linda's sincerity, but because he wanted to ensure this meeting would be productive for them both. After some thought, he agreed, scheduling a time to meet at a quiet cafe downtown. When the day came, Linda arrived early, her palms clammy and her heart racing. She spotted Harry as he entered, and she stood to greet him, her voice barely audible as she said, "Thank you for meeting with me." Harry gave her a polite nod, taking a seat across from her. Linda fidgeted with her hands, struggling to find the right words. "Mr. Rodriguez, Harry," she began, her voice shaking, "I owe you a sincere apology, not just for how I treated you, but for all the people I misjudged over the years. I never saw the harm I was causing, but I see it now, and I want you to know, I'm truly sorry." Harry looked at her, his gaze steady. "I appreciate your apology, Linda. I know this journey isn't easy, but the fact that you're willing to own up to your mistakes and work toward change is meaningful. I just hope you continue down this path." Linda nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. "I will. This experience has changed me, and I want to do something with it. I want to make amends however I can." Harry offered her a small smile, his words gentle but firm. "Then start by sharing what you've learned. Use your experience to help others understand the impact of prejudice. Sometimes, change begins with one person willing to speak up." They parted on good terms, with Linda carrying Harry's words close to her heart. She knew her path to redemption was only just beginning, but she was ready to face it head-on. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose and hope, a chance to rebuild herself into someone she could be proud of. And for Harry, as he walked away, he felt a quiet peace, knowing he had not only stood up for himself, but had perhaps set someone else on a path toward greater empathy and understanding. It wasn't just about policy change. It was about changing hearts, one story at a time. The journey to redemption. As the weeks passed, Linda's life took on a new rhythm. Each morning, she would wake early and read through articles, watch videos, and reflect on the insights she gained from the diversity and sensitivity workshops. The words of her fellow participants echoed in her mind. Their stories of discrimination and misunderstanding had opened her eyes to the world she'd spent years overlooking. Now, with the support of the Diversity and Inclusion Department, Linda found herself in an unfamiliar but welcome role, a peer mentor. The decision had come from Carmen, who had seen Linda's dedication to change and recognized the potential for her story to inspire others within the airline. With Linda's permission, Carmen had invited her to share her journey during orientation sessions for new hires, emphasizing the importance of empathy, respect, and conscious awareness in every interaction. At first, Linda had been hesitant, but a part of her felt that this was her opportunity to make things right, to help others avoid the path she had taken. One afternoon, Linda sat in a large conference room filled with new recruits, flight attendants, ticket agents, and customer service representatives. She looked out at the young faces in the room, seeing the eagerness and hope they radiated, a stark contrast to the hardened outlook she'd once held. Taking a deep breath, she began. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Linda Avery, and up until recently, I was a flight attendant at this airline for over 20 years. She paused, allowing the weight of her experience to sink in. I'm here to tell you about an experience that changed my life, one that I hope none of you will have to go through yourselves. She shared the story of her encounter with Harry Rodriguez, describing the assumptions she had made and the consequences she had faced as a result. Her words were raw, her voice heavy with regret. She could feel the silence in the room as she spoke, each word sinking in as the recruits listened intently. This wasn't the typical orientation speech, and she could see in their faces the impact it was having. I thought I knew who belonged in first class. I thought I understood people based on appearance, on the stereotypes I had unconsciously clung to. But I was wrong. And that mistake cost me dearly. She paused, her gaze traveling across the room. I can't go back and change the choices I made, but I can use my story to show you the importance of treating every passenger, every person, with dignity, no matter who they are or what they look like. As she concluded, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. Ms. Avery, thank you for sharing your story. It takes a lot of courage to admit a mistake like that. Linda nodded, feeling a sense of relief. Thank you. I hope that by sharing this, we can all start to break down the walls of prejudice that have kept people from seeing each other clearly. I made assumptions that hurt others, and I'm committed to ensuring that no one here repeats my mistakes. The session concluded with a quiet sense of reflection, and Linda left feeling lighter, as though a burden had finally begun to lift. Each time she shared her story, it felt like a small act of penance, a way to channel her remorse into something constructive. It was a process of rebuilding herself, one step at a time. Meanwhile, at the corporate headquarters, Harry was following the progress of his proposal with cautious optimism. His influence on the board had been more effective than he could have anticipated, prompting the airline to adopt permanent changes in its training programs and policies. The inclusion board he had championed was now fully operational, comprised of diverse members who provided oversight on policies and held regular sessions to review company practices. The airline's leadership had agreed to Harry's conditions, understanding that his commitment was unwavering and his expectations firm. One afternoon, Harry received an unexpected invitation to speak at a company-wide meeting. The CEO, Mr. Thompson, wanted him to address the entire airline team, from the board members to the frontline staff. The event was set to be held in a large conference hall, with many of the company's most influential leaders present. Standing at the podium, Harry looked out over the audience, his heart filled with a sense of purpose. He began by recounting his story, how he had entered the airline world not as a wealthy investor, but as a regular passenger with a simple ticket, and how he had been made to feel like an intruder in a space he'd rightfully paid for. The thing about respect, he said, his voice steady, is that it isn't something anyone should have to earn. It's a basic right, something that every person deserves. Whether you're a CEO, a flight attendant, or a passenger boarding a plane, respect is what binds us. When it's missing, we lose sight of each other's humanity. He described the proposals he had made and the changes he hoped to see, not just within the airline, but in society at large. His words were met with nods and applause as he spoke, and when he concluded, he noticed the CEO giving him an approving smile. Harry knew that this was only the beginning, that true change would take time and commitment. But the response from the crowd gave him hope that his efforts had planted the seeds of something meaningful. After the event, Harry was approached by Mr. Thompson, who extended his hand with a sincere expression of gratitude. "Harry, thank you for everything you've done. This company owes you a debt of gratitude for pushing us to be better." Harry accepted the handshake, giving a humble nod. "I appreciate it, but the real credit goes to those willing to make the changes. The journey has only just begun." As Harry left the event, he felt a renewed sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had used his influence to create positive change. On the other side of the city, Linda was sitting in her small home office, scrolling through an email that Carmen had sent her, congratulating her on the impact she had made in the orientation session. She had received multiple messages from new recruits thanking her for her honesty and courage in sharing her story. It gave Linda a feeling of purpose, a sense that perhaps she could still do something meaningful with her experience. Linda's journey had led her to the very edge of herself, challenging her beliefs and forcing her to confront her biases. But as she sat in the quiet of her home, she realized that this was her opportunity to rebuild herself into someone who could make a positive difference. The Diversity and Inclusion Department soon offered her a part-time role as a sensitivity consultant, helping train new employees on the importance of equity and respect. She accepted, knowing that this was her chance to contribute to a new culture, one built on understanding and empathy. Each session she led was a reminder of her past mistakes, but it also became a space where she could share the lessons she had learned and help others avoid the same pitfalls. The more Linda spoke about her journey, the more she began to see her own growth. She no longer saw her past actions as simply mistakes. They had become the foundation of her commitment to change, a pathway to redemption. One evening, after a long day of training sessions, she received a call from Harry. His voice was warm, and Linda felt a surprising sense of calm as they spoke. "I heard about your new role," Harry said. "I think it's a wonderful way to use your experience. Thank you for taking this on with such dedication." "Thank you, Harry," Linda replied, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. "It's more than just a job for me. It's a chance to make things right, to use what I've learned for something good." Harry paused, his tone thoughtful. "That's the best way to create change, Linda, by using our experiences to help others. You're on the right path." After they hung up, Linda sat quietly for a long moment, reflecting on how far she had come. Her life had changed irrevocably, but for the first time, she felt at peace with where she was. She had lost a job, but she had found a new purpose. And as she looked out at the city lights, she realized that true growth came not from perfection, but from facing our flaws and striving to become better. Linda's journey of redemption continued, and with each story she shared, each new recruit she trained, she hoped to build a legacy defined not by mistakes, but by the courage to change. And somewhere in the distance, the seeds of Harry's vision for an inclusive, respectful world continued to take root, one heart at a time. A new path forward. A year had passed since that pivotal moment in Linda's life, the day she had been forced to confront her own biases and the harm they had caused. What once felt like an irreversible fall from grace had slowly transformed into a journey of redemption, a new beginning shaped by humility, hard work, and empathy. Linda was no longer simply a former flight attendant haunted by her mistakes. She was a woman dedicated to the work of understanding, to sharing her story, and to helping others confront the biases that could quietly undermine their lives. In her new role as a sensitivity consultant with the airline's Diversity and Inclusion Department, Linda had become a familiar face to employees across all levels of the company. Her story served as both a cautionary tale and a source of hope, illustrating that change was possible, even for those who felt trapped by their past actions. Linda had gone beyond simply leading workshops. With Carmen's encouragement, she began designing a mentorship program that paired experienced airline staff with new recruits, focusing on fostering empathy and bridging cultural divides. The program included story-sharing sessions, in which mentors and mentees would open up about their personal journeys and challenges. For many, it was the first time they had ever considered how deeply rooted biases could affect their decisions and attitudes. One evening, after leading an intense workshop with flight attendants from multiple international branches, Linda sat in her quiet home, reflecting on the difference a year had made. She had seen people open up, shedding the armor of prejudice to make room for empathy. Each workshop had been a small victory, a testament to her own growth and commitment to righting her past wrongs. As she sipped her tea, Linda's phone buzzed with a notification, a message from Carmen. "Linda, I just heard from the board. They're so impressed with the program's impact that they want to expand it across all departments. We couldn't have done this without you." A surge of pride and relief washed over Linda. She had come full circle, turning her own personal failure into a foundation for positive change that would extend beyond her and touch countless lives within the airline. She replied to Carmen with heartfelt thanks, her hands trembling slightly with the weight of the news. Meanwhile, Harry Rodriguez continued to monitor the airline's progress from his office, reviewing reports that detailed the changes implemented as part of the new policies. The Diversity and Inclusion Department was thriving under his guidance, and the Inclusion Board had become an essential part of the airline's organizational culture. The airline had begun setting an industry standard, its competitors taking note of its commitment to equity and respect. One day, Harry received an email from the CEO, Mr. Thompson, inviting him to a conference where he would be recognized for his contributions to diversity and inclusion within the airline industry. He accepted, seeing it as an opportunity to reaffirm his mission and his commitment to the cause that had grown so close to his heart. The conference was held in a grand ballroom filled with executives from major airlines, corporate sponsors, and journalists eager to hear from industry leaders on the topic of diversity and inclusion. As Harry took the stage, he looked out at the audience, sensing their anticipation. He began by recounting his personal journey, the experience on the plane that had first prompted him to take action. "What I learned from that experience," he said, his voice calm and resonant, "was that true change doesn't come from a single event or a single person. It comes from a commitment to look beyond the surface, to question our assumptions, and to treat each other with respect and understanding." He went on to speak about the power of inclusive policies and the importance of representation, both in the boardroom and on the front lines. His words resonated with the crowd, and he received a standing ovation as he concluded. Harry knew that the real impact wasn't in his speech, but in the actions that people would take when they returned to their organizations, carrying the seeds of change he had planted. After the event, Harry was approached by a familiar face, Carmen, who had flown in to attend the conference. She greeted him with a wide smile, and they chatted about the progress being made within the airline. "Linda's really become a driving force for change," Carmen said, her eyes bright with pride. "She's made such an impact, Harry. I think you'd be proud of her." Harry nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction. "I am. I always hoped this would lead to something greater than just one person's redemption. It's about creating a culture that doesn't tolerate prejudice in any form." Before parting, Carmen extended an invitation to Harry. "Linda's hosting a special workshop for senior management next month. She'd love for you to attend if you're available." Harry accepted, feeling a sense of closure and anticipation. He looked forward to seeing the changes that Linda had spearheaded, changes that had grown from her own journey of growth and redemption. The day of the workshop arrived, and Harry found himself in a conference room with several of the airline's top executives, all there to learn from Linda's experience and the initiatives she had championed. Linda entered the room with quiet confidence, her presence calm and assured. She no longer looked like the woman Harry had encountered a year before. She had become someone who carried her experiences with humility, someone who had transformed pain into purpose. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, glancing around the room and pausing when her eyes met Harry's. She gave a small, grateful nod, acknowledging his presence. "Today, we're going to talk about unconscious bias, about the assumptions we carry without even realizing it, and about how those assumptions affect our decisions, our interactions, and ultimately, our lives." She spoke with an openness and honesty that resonated with the group, sharing her own story with vulnerability. She described her journey, the mistakes she had made, and the difficult path she had taken to confront her biases and make amends. Her words were filled with a wisdom that could only come from first-hand experience, and the executives listened intently, moved by her sincerity. As the session concluded, Linda opened the floor for questions. One executive, a middle-aged man with a thoughtful expression, raised his hand. "Linda," he began, "I think I speak for all of us when I say that your story has left a deep impression on us. But I'm curious, after everything you've been through, what keeps you motivated to continue this work?" Linda looked at Harry, a soft smile crossing her face before she turned back to the executive. "I'm motivated by the possibility of a world where people don't have to feel the pain I caused Harry and others like him. I want to help build a world where dignity and respect are the foundation of every interaction, regardless of someone's appearance or background." Harry felt a surge of pride as he listened, knowing that Linda had not only learned from her mistakes, but had found a way to use them as a force for good. After the workshop, Linda and Harry shared a quiet moment together, standing by the large windows overlooking the city skyline. "Thank you for everything, Harry," Linda said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I never imagined that losing my job would lead to something like this. You gave me the chance to change, and I'll always be grateful for that." Harry gave her a reassuring smile. "You did the work, Linda. All I did was open a door." They stood together in comfortable silence, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. They both knew that the fight for equality and respect was far from over, but they also knew that real change was possible when people were willing to face their flaws and grow beyond them. As they parted ways, Linda felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would continue her work, driven by a desire to create a more understanding, empathetic world. And Harry, with the satisfaction of having planted a seed of change, looked forward to the future with hope. Their lives, forever intertwined by that one encounter, had set in motion a movement that would outlast them both, a movement rooted in the belief that everyone, regardless of their past, had the power to change and to create a better world for those who followed. And as Linda walked away from the meeting room, her heart lighter than it had been in years, she knew that her story was only beginning, a testament to the power of redemption, resilience, and the courage to choose empathy over judgment, time and time again.